Is this on? Okay. Hey, Glenda, sit down. Welcome. Welcome. Bienvenue. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Bob Thacker. I'm the current president of the board. Thank you for coming. It's been a wonderful conference so far, and so it will continue to be for the rest of the day. I welcome you to this, the most revered of our conference, our spring conference traditions here in Red Cloud, and that is the passing show. I have two announcements, and then I will get out of the way. We offer our sincere thanks to Humanities Nebraska for their support of the program, which made the event freely accessible to all here. Humanities Nebraska is a statewide, nonprofit organization inspiring and enriching personal and public life by offering opportunities to thoughtfully engage with history and culture, and they receive additional funding from the Nebraska Cultural Endowment. So thank you. My second announcement, just so that everybody knows, the spring issue of the Willa Cather Review, which is entitled Willa Cather and Others, and Tom, maybe Cather and Others, if it has not yet been, it will sometime today be uploaded to our website. And for those of you who would like to have a peek at it as soon as you might, you'll be able to do that. And speaking as the issue editor who did it, actually I think it's pretty good. And it has almost nothing to do with me. In any case, it's there and you can have a look at it. And since we were trying to get it out by spring conference, we're glad we have. All right, I will now turn it over to my esteemed colleague, wherever he is, James Japp. Thanks, Bob.
Thanks, Bob. Okay, so I'd just like to welcome everyone to our passing show panel today. Specific thanks to Tracy, Rachel, Ashley, Jennifer, Nick, Laura Leah, and all the staff and volunteers who have made this wonderful weekend and wonderful event happen. So let's give them a round of applause, please. I'd like to also thank all who have presented this weekend. We've heard some very interesting papers, very interesting topics, and I think I can say for all of us that I personally feel that the state of Cather scholarship right now is very strong. So I want to thank all of those who presented this weekend. And then finally, before we start, can I get any first-timers who have been here to stand up just to see how many we still have? All right. Thank you all for being here. You won't get to do that next year because you'll be here the second time. Passing show, what is it? Well, as Bob mentioned, it's a long tradition here at the spring conference, but it's really based upon Cather's own newspaper column, which she wrote for years, both in Nebraska and in Pittsburgh. And it was really focused on the arts and the literature and culture. And as I said, it's been a long staple of the spring conference, and I'm very happy to be a part of it. First, I'd like to introduce our panelists. To my far right is Matthew Cella. Matthew is an associate professor of English at Shippensburg University. His research includes American literature, literary ecology, and disability studies. His book, Badland Pastoralism in Great Plains Fiction, features an examination of Willa Cather's shifting perspectives on Nebraska in O Pioneers and A Lost Lady. It's something we've been talking about all weekend. Have a hand for Matt. Molly Rosem is the author of Grasslands Grown, Creating Place on the U.S. Northern Plains and Canadian Plains, and she gave a very interesting discussion and topic, which most of us were here for on Thursday, days. She's where are you currently, Molly? University of South Dakota, and has written extensively, and so thanks for you for being here. Moving on. It's a long biography here. Charmian Gusky is Associate Professor of English and Director of the first-year seminar program at Belmont University. Her published work focuses on transatlantic literary studies, Henry David Thoreau, and Willa Cather. She is a member of the Willa Cather Foundation Board of Governors and is currently working on a project examining Cather and the history of whiteness. And we saw a really interesting presentation on her that she did yesterday. So thank you, Charmian. And last but not least, of course, is the Reverend Dr. Chuck Peake, who was a longtime member of the Cather Foundation Board of Governors and just has been mentioned as one of Nebraska's great poets. And so we're just so glad to have Chuck here today. The overarching kind of idea of this conference and what we need to keep in mind is what we're thinking about is why do Cather's words matter? Right? How does her work shape our understanding of the American frontier, and what can she tell us about our experiences today? So those are three kind of overarching questions that have hit, kind of centered our conference here this weekend. We've also, of course, we're celebrating her 150th birthday this year. As we heard, as we've talked about, it was a great discussion of April Twilights. We're celebrating the 100-year republication of that. Obviously, the 100 years of A Lost Lady, which I view as 150 pages of perfection. And then finally, Nebraska, the end of the first cycle. Cather's essay written in 1923 that focuses on the changes in generations in the Nebraska prairie. Bemoans the shift to materialism and shallowness in the culture. And so on Thursday, we heard Molly talk about children of settler society. of which Cather was one. And I was just wondering if when you read that essay, what were you thinking? What were some of your ideas that came to mind in connection to your own work?
Okay, here, it just needed to catch up a bit. Uh, yeah, this was a fascinating essay that she wrote, and I've read many times before. And I read it really in conjunction with Willa Cather, A Lost Lady, because I think they speak to one another very clearly. A couple of things I'll just start out that really struck me. Um, you know, she right away locates Nebraska as a part of the Great Plain. Nebraska is a part of the Great Plain which stretches west of the Missouri River, gradually rising until it reaches the Rocky Mountains, a rolling alluvial plain. She refers to this. And then she also says, the climate is important to Nebraska. And then she gives a very telling phrase there. Right after that, she says, the climate with the extremes of temperature gives to this plateau the variety which, here's the key phrase, to the casual eye at least it lacks. Many people talk about the grasslands and how you can't see anything. She says to the casual eye, but of course her eye is trained and her eye is full of experience. And my research studies all of those children who grew up in contact with the prairie. Many of us went out and visited the prairie this morning. And when you are in touch with it over the days and over the seasons, you come to know it well. And I think that anybody from the area or from the prairies of her generation, they would have read that and been, yeah, we know it's more than, it contains a huge variety. But more than this, there's so much to say, but she talks about, the next generation. And one of the things that stuck out to me this time when I read it was at the very end. She says, a full-blooded generation. What's the next, what are they going to do? It's a very interesting comment. What is she saying there? In other places, she talks about the pioneers and the first generation of children that I study, pouring their lives into the soil. And then she's saying, there's another generation coming up. Are they going to accept this, ugly crust of materialism? That's another phrase from her. Or what will they do? Are they going to be different? And here I think she's saying, when she says full-blooded, she's saying they're a generation removed from the prairie. Maybe she's sort of half-blooded because she came as a 10-year-old and, knew it in her formative years. But that next generation, they are of the prairie. And of course, that's what I call the grasslands grown. And so there's a lot more things to say there, but I think she is acknowledging this, and she is saying, there's a new relationship here to the prairie, and in some ways she's questioning it. Where are we going to go from here? But I'll leave it at there for now and let some others join in, and I'll come back to some things. Thank you.
Anyone else like to comment?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that struck me, kind of rereading it recently, the essay, is sort of she talks about the freighters being displaced by the railroad, right? And sort of we get this sort of a sense of, again, this kind of generational conflict. What is next? That we're missing something, right? Because we're moving away from kind of the frontier and the pioneer era towards the post-frontier and the post-pioneer era. And sort of just thinking of the obvious connections to what's happening in A Lost Lady, where you get that kind of transitional moment where you have the passing of the torch, from Captain Forrester as a symbol for the pioneer era, passing the torch on to the new generation of Ivan Peters. And, the kind of the questioning, the pessimism that comes through in the essay is echoed in sort of Neil's perspective on what that transition means, right, to this sort of kind of cold materialism. But I think, and this came up in a lot of the panels, sort of from this weekend, that the tension between the old generation and the new generation isn't as clear cut as Neil likes to sort of say is this sort of pure distinction between, you know, the evil Ivy Peters and the more morally heroic, you know, Captain Forrester, that there is a lot that links the two, right? They both sort of usurp Indians, right, in their own ways. They're both responsible for the transformation of a native landscape, whether, and you know, as a railroad man, Captain Forrester's development of, you know, the plains, the agricultural development of the plains is a little bit more indirect, but as the railroad man, right, he's sort of ushering in that progress that's going to, you know, deplete the native grasslands. And so what he is a part of isn't all that different from Ivy Peters draining the marsh, right, in order to make it more profitable. And so there's that kind of the tension that they're more alike maybe than Neil would want to admit, or that perhaps Cather through Neil would want to admit. But I think there is a distinction between them, and I think that distinction has to do with their perspective towards the landscape, whereas Ivy is more kind of unidimensional or one-dimensional in sort of his land use practices. Drain the marsh equals profit, right? It gives him the wealth and status to usurp the usurp the captain's power. And so, whereas the captain, if we sort of see him as sort of emulating Alexandra Berkson and Antonia, has a much more multi-dimensional attitude towards sort of the land use practices that has aesthetic value, that appreciates the sort of the intrinsic, you know, ecological value of the landscape, that understands its historical and cultural value. And while these are kind of sort of precedents of what might we see as a germ of a more sustainable approach, you know, sort of to our interactions with the landscape, that multidimensionality does separate, you know, sort of the captain and who he embodies from this sort of new generation, you know, that Cather seems a little bit more, you know, pessimistic or cynical about.
Chuck?
Okay, sure. Is this working? Yes, it is. I'm going to broaden my perspective a little bit, and because I think that you guys have done so well about talking about the specificities within Nebraska and think about what this essay means in the larger context of the nation which it was written for. And you know, I can't even get past the beginning of Nebraska, the end of the first cycle, that Nebraska is somehow indicative of the beginning being the end. And so you know, she tells me early on, she says, you know, that she's going to give me a social history. She says Nebraska is a newer state than Kansas. It was a state before there were people in it. So Nebraska as an entity, a self unto itself that is not necessarily coterminous with the nation. Its social history falls easily within a period of 60 years, and the first stable settlements of white men were made within the memory of old folks now living. And of course, you know, anytime she uses white, my ears prick up, and I notice it because she doesn't actually use white settlers very often, so I paid attention to that. I also see going on a distinction that she's making between Americanization and maintaining cultural identity within European communities, which she obviously thinks is very important. And we see that outlined here, and America does not fare well, right? So I see her relating Americanization with this drive for capitalism, for progress, for material gain, for wealth, and the industrialization of the farmlands that she's trying to keep as farms. And I love that she talks about there is a Prague in Nebraska as well as in Bohemia, and she goes on to talk about Germany and Czech citizens and German citizens, and she says Americanization has doubtless done away with all of this, and that loss there is bigger than what we're just seeing in Nebraska. And so she's using Nebraska as an example of this. And finally, before I turn it over to Chuck, I'm so excited to be sitting next to one of the first people I met, Cather scholars actually, outside of Ann Romine, so this is a real honor. She talks about she distinguishes the European settlers from the New England settlers. and the southern settlers, right? So she is very much depicting Nebraska as a place of European heritage, which she's bemoaning the loss of. So.
Thank you. I'm recalling an occasion in class when a student began to extol the virtues of the pioneers and lamenting that you didn't have that kind of hardihood, that kind of heroic effort anymore. And he was sitting between two older students, both women, who were single mothers of 2 or 3 children, who were struggling to go to school, make a living, raise those kids. And I'm thinking, you know, if we only identify heroism as what the earliest white settlers had, you're going to miss a lot of heroism that comes around you today. They don't appear the same way. Cather begins that essay. It's a remarkable essay in some ways, and it's beautifully written, but she begins it like Walter Prescott Webb begins his work on the plains, with the weather, the climate, the nature, the hardships that imposed. That's all well and good. But in a way to call it a social history, she begins by saying, you know, there was nobody out here before. We became a state before there were people. Not quite so. It depends on how you looked at who were people. And I think that's a continuing debate in American society. What do we mean by the people? Who are the people? Who gets included in that peopledom? And then she does come to that point where she says, okay, we have to face the fact, and this is wonderful, we have to face the fact that's all gone, that's over. Not many people do face that fact. There are a lot of people still living in Nebraska who are still thinking about it in those terms and trying to live life in that kind of scale of values and that set of things. But wonderful, she's been faced. But then she says, you know, I'm full of hope. I don't know what the next generation will be like, but I think there's still stuff out there and they can be. We moved to this state in 1953, which would have been 30 years later, and they had certainly made something of the state all right, but I'm not sure it was something that would have been entirely pleasing to Cather, then 6 years dead, that this was the state she hoped that they would make. So in a way, it's a wonderful essay, and it does bring up several things that are quite right, and in another way, it seems to me it misses what it says to be a social history because it excludes so much from that history.
James, you care if I jump in again?
No, please do.
Okay. I appreciate, Dan, what you said about, you know, bringing it back to a lost lady, and towards the end, right, it's clear the tension between these generations, and I do think the draining of the swamp is a key thing, and I think for her, even for Cather, right, says, you know, he had power over people who loved these unproductive meadows, and a very common response for those kids, and he experienced it as a child. But then, you know, the novel starts out, and I find this really interesting and important that she made Mr. Forrester a railroad man, right? And at the very end, she says, you know, we've come to the end of road making in the West, and Neil says, you know, that the very country itself was changing so fast that there was nothing to come back to. And I think it's important to remember that, you know, it's World War I where we have the big plow up, and there's a huge expansion of agriculture, you know, and in this essay she says, you know, Nebraska is one big farm. It's the pastures that kind of look lonely, whereas when she came, there was all of this land that had still yet to be plowed. And although it's called the end of the first cycle, I think an important difference between the book and the essay is the essay, she suggests what's the next cycle. She very quickly says, you know, we should motor across the state from, you know, Omaha to the Colorado line, and that the automobile is all, and that one of 6, you know, that there's an automobile for 1 of 6 Nebraskans, and, you know, that, you know, she starts to use the language of the next generation is going to be in the driver's seat, you know, and the automobile, the tractor is plowing, you know, more and more land, and it's changing, and we're moving towards that, great disjuncture in agriculture that she's going to die before she really sees the implications of that by the 1980s. But she's on to that. I think she's sensing that something has speeded up. And of course, the Great Plow-Up, helps to make the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl what it is because of that expansion. And during World War I, the U.S. government was, food will win the war, expand, 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 right? So she's on to the next cycle. I think she's not quite sure what's going to happen, but I think that's a really important difference between A Lost Lady, which kind of looks at those first two, and the essay goes over that material, but pushes then forward, and she's talking about things that are happening right around her then.
Yes. Please.
We'll move on to
Please,
your next
no.
topic. And again, so thinking of like what's the solution for her, and I love that in speaking to the nation, she's giving perhaps people that don't understand farmland and prairies a solution, and guess what it is? The humanities. Right? And I was like, oh my gosh, people are still, Cather was still worrying about the humanities, which, I worry about every day. So I was so happy to see that, we're still hanging on. And so she says that, and she repeats this phrase twice in the essay, the elasticity in mind. That's her hope, and that's what she doesn't see and what she fears in the Americans, particularly the New Englanders and the Southerners, that she witnesses, that they do not have the same elasticity of mind that she sees in her Nebraskan folk. And she sees that because this commingling of communities. And we're going to find that in the university. So she is really a proponent here of education beyond the farmland. So I just want to give that plug. Did you want to? Okay.
Me? Sure. Let's see, where are we here? There we go. So our second question, I think this will get some discussion going. I'm throwing this one out to our panel. We heard an excellent panel earlier this week on Cather's poetry. And I think two of our panelists, Becky and Bob, mentioned Prairie Spring as a poem that would they would put up and stand up with some of her best. I hope I'm correct in that. And so this is a poem that appeared in both the earliest version and then in April Twilights and Other Poems in 1923, with very little emendations, very few changes, just a few punctuation changes. So I want to read this, and I want to ask our panel what they think about this poem in relation to what we've heard and we've been listening to today. So let me just take a few minutes here. Evening and the flat land, rich and somber and always silent. The miles of fresh plowed soil, heavy and black, full of strength and harshness. The growing wheat, the growing weeds, the toiling horses, the tired men. The long empty roads, sullen fires of sunset fading, the eternal unresponsive sky. Against all of this, youth, flaming like the wild roses, singing like the larks over the plowed fields, flashing like a star out of the twilight. Youth with its insupportable sweetness, its fierce necessity, its sharp desire, singing and singing out of the lips of silence, out of the earthy dusk. Great poem. So as I was reading that, and with your own research and thinking and prepping for this, what are your thoughts? Anything coming to mind?
Okay, yeah, go ahead. Okay, sure. Yeah, so I'm looking at it on my phone. I'm not checking text. I'm sort of looking at the poem. And this was the epigraph to O Pioneers. Is that true? One edition.
Yes.
Of it. And so I would say, really, all of Cather's Nebraska is sort of embodied in this poem. Sorry, trouble with the microphone. That all of Nebraska, all of Cather's version of Nebraska, or perspective of Nebraska, is here. Even kind of anticipating some of the themes we just talked about, and thinking about a lost lady and the end of the first cycle of Nebraska, because you have a reverence for the land, the flat land, its silence, its emptiness, its character, and how that sort of imparts a sense of place, right? For the speaker of the poem and for Cather. You have the youth, right, and sort of the vigor, and of course, so I read this in the context of Alexandra Bergson, right, who is cultivating the landscape and getting something from it. But you have, right, sort of already, you have the sunset, you have the twilight, you have the earthy dusk. So sort of, right, anticipating, right, that this is only just a part of a cycle that has a beginning and an end. And that youth, right, that is capitalized in the poem, and that is, again, kind of embodied by Alexandra Bergson and Antonia, right, becomes sort of the aging of Captain Forrester, right, who is debilitated by a stroke and sort of by an accident, uses a cane, right, and sort of again embodies the twilight, right, of this first cycle. So the optimism and the cynicism are kind of captured here, anticipated, but also sort of emulated, I think in the words of the poem.
I see very simply, and because Cather's such a good poet, it's just lovely every line, but what I hear are the plowed lands and the wild roses and the sky, a dark sky where you can see the stars, and a kind of landscape that attracts meadowlarks. So the tame and the wild mixed together, that key sense of place that I was trying to articulate on Thursday in my essay, that this is very, I can tell you, that kind of mixture for this generation. They're attached to all of these things together, and that's the place they envision.
I got one. That's hard to know where to begin there. At the end of Kenneth Michael's talk on The Lost Lady the other day, he was giving us a philosophical framework in which to maybe see the ending lines of that novel. And in his case, a particularly Hegelian setup. And it was an interesting talk. But afterwards, we were talking about the problem you have with the richness of Cather is that every time you think you've got a scheme that's going to capture her, several other schemes she's working with keep coming in, and here that notion of youth, and not my youth when I was young, any youth, that youth brings something to the table that is lost, and she loved, whether she was talking about London or talking about Nebraska, those roses keep coming up, and they're a wonderful image, because if they're dying and browning, that is the sign of something gone rotten, and if they're there fulgent, and Mary Vaughan's painting of it out in the gallery is a wonderful reminiscence of those roses coming up. And she, I don't know that anybody with any poetic history has said, look, here's an imagist poet. But clearly she relied very heavily in her poetry on an image that attracted her, and then tries to convey it in a way that will attract us to the same feelings and emotional tenor that she'd experienced. And in that poem, I think you get pulled into that poem so that you're experiencing something of what she was experiencing. And so about one time I thought, this is sort of the gospel of youth. This is several years before Elvis Presley, and the youth culture. But then you begin to realize that's not, she's still in the first cycle, extolling those few old souls who are still here and might give ballast to the ship as it sails. So it's a much more complicated vision. But in that poem, that's really a strong feature of that poem.
Well, I'm going to be the more pessimistic. So this is what I heard. Growling, twirling, tired, fading, unresponsive, flaming, silence. Not quite the same. But I agree with the youth. But for me, I saw it as a youthfulness of place and the state of Nebraska, and that it's so young, yet it is fading already. And so that's really all I have to say.
Other responses? It's interesting to me to read the poem. I read it before I read Nebraska, the end of the cycle, and then I read it after I read that much more pessimistic essay. And I think it changed my interpretation a little bit. I don't know if anybody else had a similar experience, or is that any connections between that poem and the essay? Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think because I was just rereading it, right, sort of now, and sort of before you read it. Yeah, I guess that emphasis on the twilight, right, sort of on the kind of more pessimistic tones, that were pointed out, comes forward a little bit more. And again, it's obviously anachronistic, but I think maybe that was something that was already in Cather's imagination before she can, fully articulate, that sense of pessimism that we get, in 1923.
Thank you.
The sound of this, I think it's all right. If you're whether you're betting on the young or the old, you're in either case betting on a losing horse. It's going to lose a little quicker if it's old, but that's what's going to happen to the young. And I think one of the things that's a constant theme in her is those things that you embrace at one point and then you see fading away. There's nothing you can do to stop that, except maybe to summon from someplace some hope that the next youth are going to come along and do something. And she seems to be able to summon that hope again and again, but not because she's not pretty aware of the realities.
Any other responses?
I just keep thinking about unresponsive sky and silence. You hear those two phrases or something similar a lot, or you read a lot in people's memoirs and poetry. Is the unresponsive sky a constant? And there's something about being under that sky and the sun that sort of makes you face yourself, and there's a silence, but of course the silence is full of all of the growing sounds and the birds and all of that. So it's a particular kind of prairie silence, and I think that a lot of people in this generation have this relationship where they feel exposed and they feel affirmed and anxious at the same time. It's an agonized kind of relationship.
Excellent, thank you. So let's turn more towards a lost lady and Marion Forster, please, because we've heard much discussion about her this weekend. And when I was rereading the novel, I noticed how little dialogue that she actually has in the novel. Most of her talks are really mostly pleasantries or greetings. There's only a few times where she reveals herself. One of the times is when she's on the phone with Frank Ellinger, but he's on the other side. We don't hear his conversation. We don't hear that. And then the one time where she's with Niels and she's talking about dancing and wearing new clothes. We don't hear a whole lot, but we hear a lot about her. We hear a lot about her, and we've talked about that a lot. Neil, of course, Ivy, the narrator, Mrs. Beasley and Molly Tucker, local gossips, who after Captain Forster has another stroke, the quote is, "They perfectly agreed upon that it was a judgment upon his wife." Mr. Ogden, who offers her a pension, and then Ed Elliott, who is the last word to Neil about the remarriage and finally death in South America of Mrs. Forster. So, what do you think of that, panelists? What do you think of Mrs. Forster and the multiple perspectives, the complicated depiction of her within the novel? What are some of your, maybe from what we've heard this weekend, or our connections to a variety of talks and theories?
I'll start just with going back to the reference that you made about her visit to Glendale Springs to visit the Dalzells. Some of you may recall this is her first trip away from the ailing Captain Forster, and she, because of the investments that Ivy Peters has made with the Indians, quote unquote, she is able to afford a little getaway. And she also tells Neil that she needs to go, or she decided that she would go as an experiment to see if she had anything worthwhile, if there was anything left, and this is a quote, worth saving. And this is what she says once she got there, her observations of the visit. But I looked well enough. Yes, I did. I always know how I am looking, and I looked well enough. The men thought so. I looked happier than any woman there. They were nearly all younger, much, but they seemed bored to death. After a glass or two of champagne, they went to sleep and had nothing to say. I always look better after the first glass. It gives me a little color. It's the only thing that does. I accepted the Dalzells' invitation with a purpose. I wanted to see whether I had anything worth saving, and I have, I tell you. And so this is one of the few monologues we have of her actually speaking, and that this is where we get insight into what she's thinking, and she's thinking about surviving, and she's thinking about how she's going to survive based on what she has to give in terms of entertaining the men around her and what her value is on the market, as we say. And so to me, that is saying that her options have become limited, but they're still out there. And by focusing on her understanding of this, she is not under some illusion or fantasy about what her relationship is with the captain, or with what her options are as she ages. Without, I mean, she has very little income. She's not going to be able to go work. So how is she going to survive into the latter part of her life? So.
Yeah, I mean, I always read her as kind of this counterpoint to Neil's bemoaning, the end of the road making west, as sort of a symbol of endurance and persistence, that she sort of goes with the changes and sort of, rather than rejecting it and, throwing the flowers down in the mud, she is looking for a way to continue, right? Even if she's not connected to the land, and she's not really sort of in the pioneer sort of dimension of Cather's universe. There is that persistence and endurance that is that counterpoint, to sort of, to what Neil sees or envisions for the West, before he and like a lot of her characters and Cather herself, abandons Nebraska for other places.
By the time we get to Lost Lady, we've had quite a number of years of the discourse about the revolt against the village, and in the course of that discourse, many authors, and I'm thinking of historians like Randolph Bourne and Elsie Cruz Parson and Joseph Woodcrouch and Lionel Trilling, literary critics, etc. They've begun to talk about a kind of split personality in the American personality. The reminiscent of Gertrude Stein's "Nothing much in the 20th century agrees with anything else in the 20th century." And one of the ways they define that is that you now have a number of young people. It's always cast as young people. You now have a lot of young people who have kind of veered one way or the other. They're people of action. They're people who are alive. They're people who have that certain grittiness of life in them. And then there are people whom, and the phrase was, have adopted the spectatorial attitude, that they are mere spectators of the scene. My suspicion has always been that probably the advent of film had something to do with creating that spectatorship as a kind of vicarious life. And my sense is, at least in the broad scope of Cather, she is not opposed to intellect or opposed to thoughtfulness, but she always comes down on the side of people who are living. Not people who are thinking about living, not people who are watching other people live, but of Marion Forster, it said she had the power to live. And we don't see that in Neil. Now, maybe Neil tomorrow will have grown enough to have, but at this point, he's the spectator. And we have that run through her. Jim Burden, as you recall, is at the beginning scene captured in an observation car. He's observing. He's not the alive person. The professor is not the live character, and that's Tom Outland who's the live character. And so there's that constant play in her fiction of that thematic thing in that discourse. I think I know where Cather comes down. Giving her, she's very nuanced in things, but that's where I think she is.
I think you may have answered, one of my questions I've been thinking about as I've been listening to all these wonderful papers is, several people read from some letters or some notes of Cather saying, that she really just wanted to focus on this, Marion Forster or Lila Graeber, and that was the all for her in this book. And I kept thinking, what is it that really that Cather really wants from this? Why this woman? I don't know if anybody has any more insight into why Lila. What was it? What do we know about her interactions with her even when she was younger? The other thought I had, and this is still more of a question, but is there any significance to the fact that Mrs. Forster is a Californian? She's not a New Englander, an Easterner. She's a Californian, and I keep thinking about the whole Western mythology and sort of for Cather, for people that I study, the revolt of the village is also a revolt against the frontier and frontier mythology. It's a very interesting version of that I don't think always gets out there. And they all talk about railroads. That's very important to their revolt, their village revolt. But they're thinking about the whole West. And the fact that she's a Californian, I don't know that I heard many people talk much about that. So I don't know if any of you have any insight into the model or her being a Californian and what that might mean.
Well, there's so much I want to say. Let me first say that when Chuck was talking about the spectator, and Neil, of course, as the spectator, I've always envisioned Mrs. Forster as a spectacle, and her having complete understanding and control of the persona, the spectacle that she creates. I mean, we see that when she's on the front porch with her buttery spoon and cherry stained fingers. She knows exactly what sort of performance she's giving at all times. And she's also, she knows that she can, that's a kind of her cultural commodity, right? Being the spectacle. So I love that, the spectacle relationship. And then California, I just figured, it's what we always think about people from California, right? That it's sort of like free thinking. Someone that is there, boundaryless in a way.
Daughter of miners.
Yeah, and there seems to be wealth, but also progress, but maybe questionable progress, questionable actions. There and new industry and wealth, but there's still, it's this burgeoning state that is still so diverse that it's undefinable in terms of one specific characteristic that we could say with like a Nebraskan or a Virginian.
Right, or somebody coming from New England. I guess, the idea of trying to become that lady or that Victorian image that Neil, comes up with. But Californians were still trying to say, well, we are, you know,
Yeah.
part of that, even though we aren't New England, right?
Yeah.
We're the West, and,
Yeah.
and I'm of the West. So I just thought that choice was important.
Absolutely, and so far west, and it's
Yeah.
coastal, which also
Yeah,
is
yeah, yeah.
suspicious.
The
Right?
other coast, right?
Yeah.
You got the New England, and you got the
Right.
coastal as opposed to middle
Yes,
America.
exactly. And the lack of seasons, one always worries about that.
Yeah.
I was told that this is why not a lot of good poetry comes from California because of the lack of seasons. But yeah, JJ. So we were staying at the second home, so I have an unfair advantage here because we were looking at the book and we were talking about the epigraph that "Oh come, ladies, come," which is from Hamlet, of course, but it's also from The Wasteland. And thinking about Marion Forrester is as a type of Ophelia, that a woman who doesn't have a lot of agency is one way of thinking about her. But I think that is the way that Neil sees her, because Neil wants her to die. Right? And we talked about this. Like, he wants her to commit sati. He says, "Why?" I mean, this is the cruelest statement he makes in the entire novel. He says, "Why doesn't he emulate herself on the funeral pyre?" Right? This would be more, a more suitable ending for her rather than trying to recreate her life.
And importantly, though, I think, like she says, like the other wives of railroad men or big men, right? So, and I think also that California aspect comes in because with Neil, why doesn't she do that? Well, she's not from the prairie. She's not from the frontier. And we forget she's 25 years younger than Mr. Forster. So he wants her to, like you said, kill herself on his grave or on his sundial, whatever it's going to be. And I'm also thinking of the various spectacles that she does when she walks down to see the boys playing at the lake, and she's bareheaded. Right? That's an important thing that the boys and Neil notices.
Those of you who saw the film today, I think that's the one thing that the film gets correct is the spectacle that she creates when she walks in the room and the way she carries herself and the clothing. And I thought they did a good job with the telephone, which is the one thing that connects the book and the essay and the movie today. Was the film actually ends so abruptly? I don't know about you guys, but I thought it was a false ending. But with the telephone, which in the novel seems to be used as a connection, but also a disconnect that Cather seems to be critiquing about her use of the telephone here, that Neil, and remember, he cuts the wire. It's his like gallant portrayal of his one time that he can actually save her this time from the dreaded telephone and reaching out to Frank Ellinger. But she seems to praise the telephone in the Nebraska essay. The dual impulse of the negative and the positive that Chuck was talking about.
She also really talks about moviegoers in the essay as well, and not very positive. Any other?
Well, and where do the movie stars come from that play in the movies? California. Yeah. So the movie stars are coming from California, right, in the spectacle, so that works with.
We didn't plan this material, by the way. Any other comments on that question? And I think I'll just ask one more here. Cather in 1923, as we've talked about, was at the height of her literary powers. Right, she had just won the Pulitzer for one of ours. A Lost Lady had just come out to high praise. But now we're talking about 100 years later. Why does Cather, specifically A Lost Lady, remain relevant to today? All of you can jump up at once. Hello.
Well, I mean, I think her legacy and what makes her relevant is because I think, we can continue to talk about and debate, what Marion Forrester, represents, right? That we're always going to engage, and she always engages with, Cather does in her work, interesting issues of the ambiguity of, whether it's gender, sort of cultural identity, the role of place, that she sort of tackles things that are, obviously timeless. And I was just teaching Maya Antonia this past semester for the, teaching Cather for the first time in a while, and the course was a course on, sort of literary theory and research, which is not a thing that I'm asked to teach. It's not a thing I'm very familiar with, and it had been 10 years since I taught it. So I said, well, if I have to relearn in order to teach structuralism and why it's different from post-structuralism, the books I'm going to choose to be the templates for, how we apply these theories and talk about them were going to be things that I was very familiar with and enjoyed, so I didn't necessarily have to reread them, although I did. And Maya Antonia was one of them. And I guess I shouldn't be surprised, but when it came time, at the end of the semester when they had to write their final research papers, 75, 80% of the students in the class chose to write about Maya Antonia and kept coming back to it regularly in conversations. And talking about gender, talking about sexuality, talking about, sort of, whether Jim is reliable or not. And so just to sort of see, right, the younger generation, right, sort of still be fired up, right, about the same kind of issues that Cather brings to the table that fired me up as, sort of, a high school student when I first read A Lost Lady. That's still there, right? So I think the students felt that relevance, right, and were able to kind of apply it to their own, sort of modern situation.
I'm going to tweak your question a bit and just say, kind of going to, why is she relevant, or why is she important today? Why do her words matter, as the program said, and how does she shape our understanding of the frontier? I mean, her words matter because she helped provide a sense of place for settler society. She expressed how many people felt. She recorded a landscape that is largely disappeared. And it's important for us today, and we relate to it today. The Willa Cather Foundation is preserving a prairie remnant that we can use today, right? She helped. It's through Cather that we are able to connect to these landscapes that we have today, and that's all very important. Another really important thing is, I think, for quote frontier, or our understanding of the West, is Cather made immigrant communities, the Czech Bohemians, the German boys in A Lost Lady, Norwegians, Danes. She mentions them all in this end of the first cycle. And I'll just point out that my last name, Rosum, is a Czech Bohemian name from Czech Bohemians that settled in South Dakota. And I remember, reading this, it's like, oh, someone wants to talk about my immigrant background, And I think for her to preserve those experiences are, she's important for that. And this is at a time when 100% Americanism, World War I, and getting rid of German taught at universities, and everyone was, at the time all across the plains you'd have religious services in all sorts of foreign languages. And this was a brave thing to do, to be talking about this in 1923 when we're in the middle of restricting immigration in a widespread way. That's also the end of the first cycle, I think, where once immigrants were welcomed through all of this legislation, through homestead laws, through wide open borders, all of a sudden, there's a lot of negativity. And I think her works communicated a different attitude. So I think that's why she's important, all of those things for us today.
Yeah, thank you. That's wonderful. And my recent work that I've been doing around race and whiteness, using A Lost Lady to think about the way that those communities no longer were seen as Czech or Norwegian, but as white, and the problems that come with that. And right, the Americanization of those cultures, which erase their specificity in order to create a dominant white race. So that's, of course, very important for us to understand in order to maintain Cather's relevancy in a very, racially contested world. And as we heard last night, things aren't great for women either. And so it's easier for me to teach a book like A Lost Lady in Nashville, Tennessee, to talk about heteronormative stereotypes of gender and marriage with Tennessean students who are really from all over. But because, this to them is lost in space and time, we can talk more freely about the roles of women and the options that were available to someone like Marion Forrester at that time. So,
in an honors class for sophomores one time, the class was on Faulkner and Cather, and I just for fun, it's a small class, and I'd said one day, come next time with what you think is a theme in Neighbor Russicki, and with one condition. I'm just going to pick somebody arbitrarily to name a theme, and the next person can't name the same theme. You've got to get going. And they had no trouble with that whatsoever. I mean, there's dozens, and here we've talked about the theme of the immigrant and the place of the immigrant, and we're still talking about that today in our politics. And overarching some of those is embedded too in the first cycle, and embedded in a lot that she wrote is how does the new world greet the old world? How does the old world influence the new world? And you'll recall that all got cast in a semi-religious tone. This was the new Eden, and sorry to the women in the audience, but it was the new Adam, right? What's the new Adam going to do? And one thing after another that Cather chronicles is, well, here's the problem with the new Eden and the new Adam. They just become the old Eden and the old Adam, and this is what happened to California. Right? Unfortunately, California was populated by people from Ohio and Nebraska and Iowa who went out there and proved what? That they could turn California into something less than paradise. We one of the themes in frontier studies, like Henry Nash Smith, was the frontier is that place which disappears once we discover it. Once we're there. And we're the problem. It's the old Pogo cartoon. They've met the enemy, and it's us, right? And she is Cather is a wonderful explorer of that phenomena, which she then weaves into immigrants, et cetera, et cetera. And it's just one of those places where you see such a richness. And one of those differences of old world and new comes out particularly here on the plains where we live. World War II kind of obliterated our memory of this, but when World War I is looming, this area of the world was decidedly pacifist. These people, immigrant people, had fled wars that they did not feel had any bearing on their lives except to take their lives. And they were not about to send their in those days, sons, today we'd say sons and daughters, off to fight another war like that. It was a hard sell to sell World War I to the American public. We can hardly believe that today when you can sell a war every other day or two. But in those days, there was a complete resistance. So how does the new world accept the old? And what influence does the old have on the new? Is I think, an enduring theme in Cather's work, and kind of encompasses some of those other themes we've been talking about.
Any other comments? Anybody? I'd like to just apologize to California for this. So now we're going to take a few questions from the audience, and I think we've got some that. If you have a question for our panelists, grab a note card and write it down. We have a bit of time. Yes. Yes.
I just want to make a note of thanks. There are people not here today that we certainly miss. Joe Ergo, who wrote so brilliantly about immigration, and Ann Romines, who's in rehab right now. But we have somebody with us who deserves attention. We're all flashing around the book of poetry, and Bob Thacker has done as much as anybody to elevate the study of her poetry, which is really worthwhile because, like Faulkner and others, she begins as a poet. And she never ceases to be a poet. She just quits writing poetry. I mean, right? She then turns to be a poetic novelist, and it's a wonderful feature of her work.
Can I make a shameless plug too?
Yes, yes. That's a,
The
we've
New
been doing that all
York
weekend.
City, New York City International Seminar is coming up soon, and so if you haven't registered, please do. You can register up until the very last day. There's no closed registration, and Wade Leake and I today were just finalizing the party details. Our closing ceremony is going to be on top of the iconic Sony building, which few people ever in their lifetime get to actually be there and to see the view. And so it's going to be a wonderful event with lots of great speakers and interesting topics. And we're really trying to explore and open up Cather, diverse readings of Cather. So if you haven't registered, please do.
And if you want to know more about it, Wade Leake is right there in the back, and Jay Yost is right over here, and you can ask them about it.
Okay, so let's move on to some questions here. With the inclusion of how both the captain and Ivy Peters obtain their land, do you think Cather is commenting about the nation's treatment of indigenous peoples as opposed to the untouched view of the prairie she writes in her earlier works, such as O Pioneers?
Well, I'll just say about, I'll let you speak about O Pioneers maybe, because it's been a minute since I've read that one, but for Captain Forrester and for Ivy, in an initial first reading, I think, the captain, he of course he builds the Forrester property on Indian encampment, but what we later learn is that he actually buys that land from the railroad, because the railroad bought up all of the territory there and then chose who to sell the land to. And so he's not going and, independently homesteading. He's actually homesteading through the railroad, which I think is an important point to make.
Yeah, and I think, JJ had emailed us, prior to the conference, talking about, and it was sort of in the Red Cloud Chief newspaper, that the Cather sculpture is going to be, in the Statutory Hall, sharing the Nebraska space, with Standing Bear, right, who's sort of representing the fight for Native sovereignty and for recognizing personhood. And so that's an interesting kind of combination there, right, because of, I think, the allusions to the Native presence on the landscape, which is so often described as empty before the frontier arrives, whether they're coming up consciously or subconsciously, right, they are appearing. There was a paper yesterday sort of talking about the Gothic versus Romantic elements, in the novel, and that you can't really reference the Black Hills, right, without bringing up that history, right, that complex, sort of, again, the tension between the native inhabitants and the pioneers. And we see that obviously with the naming of Black Hawk, right? So we have these allusions throughout, Cather's Nebraska novels to that history, but never really confronting it in any direct way, right? So this is kind of the prequel to the first cycle, right? That she maybe and others are imagining as already having ended, but again, they kind of allusions to that history do kind of pop up, and so the reader has to reckon with them, even if Cather didn't consciously do so.
Yeah, I would just say, there's a lot of silences. I did find it interesting that, she brought up the, what Ivy Peters is doing with the land, and I have a feeling that probably is referring to perhaps more allotment land and some of the ways settlers were encroaching upon land that kind of come after the Homestead Act, or leasing, or there's a lot of work that needs to be done to understand that. But Kat, if you don't know that history, it's easy to read over her very slim references. She doesn't take it on. She really doesn't take it on. I'll just agree with that.
Unresponsive is a fascinating word. That's the question. Isn't that also a word you might use to refer to God or mystery or wonder. Could Cather imply more than silence or lack of response with that word? And then it's a kind of a follow-up. Can Prairie Spring simply be a poem about cycle, meaning what a garden does and are the seeds? I can't read that word, but youth, okay, and youth are the seeds. I'm sorry. Okay. Unresponsive is a fascinating word. Isn't it also a word you might use to refer to God or mystery or wonder? Could Cather imply more than silence or lack of response with that word? And then can Prairie Spring simply be a poem about cycle or meaning what a garden does and youth are the seeds?
Yes.
Next question.
I'm going to probably make a misattribution here because I can't really remember, but it'll sound good if I act like I know. I think it was Baudelaire who said something about if you like a happy ending, you have to remember that whether it's a happy or unhappy ending only depends on when the writer stops the narrative, right? And because that allows for the fact that if you went on with the story, or if you got the story earlier, it might be either comedy or tragedy, because that's life. And out of that grows a whole school of mystical theology, in which God is the silent partner, which we only hear God in the silence, or in which it is in the cloud of unknowing. It's what we don't know that guides us. So sure, I think that's right, and I don't think Cather was. I don't have any evidence she was aware of that, but she writes like somebody who was aware of all that.
Yeah, I agree, absolutely. And the beauty about poetry is that there are so many interpretations, and there is never just one interpretation. And I think why we're here today and why we continue to celebrate and read Cather's work is because of the poetic elements in the novel that open up so many interpretations, and that they're not static. And it's and depending on one's perspective, one is going to view the words with their history, and that's what makes it wonderful and open and continual. So, yes.
And I would think of unresponsive as also ever present. There's sort of something about the plains landscape, whether it's dressed in wild grasses or dressed in farmland. There's still that horizon look. There's that big sky, and it's kind of there, it's ever present, kind of watching, and yeah.
Who asked Cather to write her essay? I don't know the answer. Or was it something she wanted to express and then went out and found an outlet?
There was a whole series of these essays that the Nation produced week after week, each date, and they tried to get somebody significant to write each essay. So South Dakota had one, and you can look these up in the Nation. It's a series. I don't know if they actually did every state, but I think that was, they do every state. For Nebraska. Yeah. No, okay, no correspondence about it. Yeah, I have a whole folder of these. I often thought it would be a really good regional project to read all of these essays and come up with an essay, but it's the whole series is entitled These United States, and this is number 37, Nebraska, the end of the first cycle. So the whole series is called These United States, and so it was just a regular feature in the Nation magazine in the 20s.
Interesting. We have one more question, I think, and how do we make Cather's work more relevant to racially, ethnically diverse communities? And if we knew that answer, what do you think? Charmian, why don't you start us off?
Well, for me, it's opening up a question about whiteness, because I can't speak from other perspectives, but I can speak from the white perspective, and because she was a white author, to recognize and acknowledge that openly and look for the places in her text that allow us to critique, and this is not necessarily a criticism, but to understand what this thing is, what whiteness is, and what it means to be a white writer during the time that Cather was living, and to be very open and honest about that, and to allow a forum of discussion about race in novels where there is seemingly little to say, but actually to read beneath the text to hear those utterances, the hauntings, if you will.
Yeah, and I think actually to focus on her discussion of different ethnic groups and the way they are portrayed too, I think because they were part of groups who claimed whiteness eventually as the generations moved on, we forget how racialized they were. Some of their foodways, some of their costuming, there's racialization of these groups. And so I think there's a way to do that, to talk about these struggles and put them in relation to additional racial problems that the United States had, and the immigration laws, and the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, and Nordic thinking, scientific racism in this period that she is writing. So I think there's a lot of work that can be done, and so happy you're doing your project.
Yeah, and I would say sort of thinking about her as constructing a sense of place and contributing to the story of Nebraska specifically, but the Great Plains, as a region more generally, right? To put her in conversation with other diverse voices, reading her alongside of Louise Erdrich or Oscar Michaud, Arabelle Thompson, right? So you're kind of getting an understanding of the place as being made up of and storied by very different experiences, culturally, racially, and so on, so that you're getting the bigger picture and sort of seeing Cather and in relation to those other voices.
One of the things that's taken place occasionally here, Charles Johannigsmeyer organized one of these, I believe, was to have invited here people from audiences that don't normally read Cather, and then to engage in Cather, and to listen to them, not try to say, here's how we're seeing, but what do you see in that? And there is room for critique in there. I had the privilege of teaching in China for 6 months, and I taught Hemingway, Faulkner, and Cather by and large. And one of the things that I would ask them is I can tell you how we look at this, and I will, but I'd like to know how you look at this. And at the time when I came home, I had collected some little short essays, and at that time, Teaching Cather was still being published by Steve Shively and Virgil Albertini, and they took some of those and ran them, and they're really interesting in terms of what those students saw in something from a completely different culture, and one frankly that mystifies them. They're very puzzled by the paradoxes of American life, and I kept trying to say, if you think you're puzzled, you ought to try to live in it, right? But I think that one good way, if you want to look at that whole subject, you can do, and it's a very wonderful effort. You can do what Charmian is doing, is just to study it. But another thing is just to bring in fresh faces and say, what do you see in that?
Thank you. Do we have any other questions from the audience? All right, that being said, I'd like to thank all of you for attending the passing show. Thanks to our panelists, Dan, Molly, Charmian, and Chuck. Thank you.